Welcome to the Living in Alignment podcast. My name is Amy Landry. Through a collage of conversations, here we distill mindful living and timeless wisdom within a modern, everyday context. Thank you for being here. Today's episode comes from the April 2024 Study Yoga Online Summit. There were a couple of sessions in the summit that I particularly felt very strongly needed to be out into the world. And I recently reached out to Emma from Shadow Yoga to see if she would allow me to publish this. And of course, she so graciously has said yes. And if you would like to check out or access the Study Yoga Online Summit sessions, there is still a lifetime access upgrade available on my website. You can go and check that out. And the good news is that there is another free online summit happening at the end of May this year, 2025. The free registration will open for that very shortly. Please do keep your eyes peeled. This conversation with Emma Balnaves takes us into the mystical landscape of Nepal, specifically the Nath yogis, the Hatha yogins, and for anyone out there that is a practitioner of asana and beyond, this is an incredibly relevant conversation for you. Emma has spent a tremendous amount of time with these yogis in Nepal and specifically in Nepal itself. And so she definitely has a wealth of insight from being on the ground over there. And I think Nepal often gets overlooked. So we think of India a lot when we think of the cultural context of yoga. So there is much to be assimilated here and enjoyed. And secondly, furthermore, Emma goes into some real experiential wisdom and knowledge that pertains to what makes up the components of complete practice. So please enjoy this episode here on the podcast with Emma Balnaves. Teaching yoga since 1995, Emma Balnaves is an internationally respected teacher of the traditional forms and philosophies of Hatha Yoga. Emma was introduced to yoga in her early teens when she became intrigued by the mystery of the practices and the feelings they evoked inside her. After studying visual communication, majoring in photography at university, and working in the creative arts in Sydney, New York, and London, Emma committed herself to a life of teaching yoga. Her early training began with a 3-year apprenticeship at the Hatha Yogashala in Bondi Junction, Sydney, Australia. After decades of in-depth study and research in yoga, Ayurveda, and other internal arts, Emma began incorporating the full spectrum of the yogic process in her teaching. In 2019, she completed her first film, Agni Yogana, which she was inspired to create as a way to share the essence of these teachings and bring a better understanding of all aspects of the practice. Emma, it really is an honor to be able to have this conversation with you and delve into some of your immense insight. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Amy.
I'd love to begin by delving into a conversation that no doubt pertains to your studies, your practice, and work over many years, but that has also relevance and importance to any yoga practitioner. With so much emphasis on India, its history and culture, that is, as the roots and source of yoga, could you shed some light on Nepal and its place, influence, and contribution to yoga, particularly perhaps Hatha Yoga?
Yes. So Nepal, yes, has a very big influence with the Hatha yogic tradition. It's interesting because I guess the research came with Nepal when Chandra and I were actually looking more into the Pashupata lineage. So the Pashupatis were a Hatha yogic tantric lineage they predate Patanjali and Buddha. Yeah. So in the early 2000s, we actually began a lot of research on the Pashupatis after coming across the text of Kaundinya's The Pashupata Sutras. And it was the Pashupatis who actually performed the nritta or pure dance. And that took them into the trance state for the seated meditation. So the interest there was very strong for us to find out more. And of course, we did a lot of research in South India, and there is evidence of Pashupata lineage in the south and in the north of India, but no kind of practicing Pashupati yogins, and there's actually not really many living temples. There's a lot of archaeological sites. So it's a bit like, the film where it's, the Temple of Doom, when the Raiders of the Lost Ark, when you're searching and searching on this quest and trying to find the treasure. So it was like that. When I started the research more on my film Agni Yogana, that's what also led us to Nepal, because of course the biggest Pashupata temple is in Kathmandu. So when we went to Kathmandu kind of mid-2000s, it was really that research into the Pashupata lineage that took us there. So, they hail forth from Mohenjo-daro, the Pashupatis. There's actually a very old archaeological site there, but it's now part of Pakistan, not India. And it was during different periods that they would go underground and then they would resurface. And it was around the time of Buddha Patanjali that they went underground again. Buddha Patanjali rose more. And then there was a resurgence of their teaching in the 1st century AD through Lakulisha, who's a great practitioner or Pashupati. And around the 8th century, the Pashupatis again went underground, and this gave rise to the Hatha Yogic teachings and the Kaula Tantrika teachings. So when we were in Nepal researching, of course, you can spend a lot of time in the Pashupata area there where the temple is. There's a huge park as well. And we were fortunate to come into contact, because of my film research as well, with Dr. Tanvan, who features in Agni Yogana as well. He was actually looked after the trust of the Pashupati temple at the time. So he had ways of, connecting us with different parts of the temple. But when we first met him, he said, you can't go into the inner temple. It's only, if you're Hindu born, and that's the only way you can go in. So, of course, which is where really the 5 faces of Shiva are, or what is the head of Pashupati. So the 5 faces plus the upward face, and then you've got actually the 6th face, which is the hidden face. But he said, just above the temple here is the Goraknath temple, which we actually had no idea about. So we went up to this is like mid-2000s, we went up to the Goraknath temple. And of course, this is where the understanding came that it was when this kind of period happened, when this surge came forth, that it's believed that Goraknath, who's the disciple of Matsendranath, he actually is an incarnation of Pashupatinath. And it was Goraknath who brought the teachings of Hatha Yoga forth during that time, around 8th century or 9th century. Different texts will say different things, or scholars. So you'll find that Goraknath was the one who said the teaching of Hatha Yoga was for all. It didn't matter what caste you were, what gender you were. He wanted to spread the teachings of Hatha Yoga. So, and his teacher, Matsendranath, he was more of a Kaula Hatha Yoga Tantrika guru. So they were very different paths in some way as well. So it was really when we came across this aspect of the temple that the understanding came that this is where in Nepal you find the Hatha Yoga teachings held forth from, and it originates with the Pashupata lineage. So, and when we go back, Pashupata lineage predates so many things. So a little bit of information also that I found when I was researching for the film at the time is what's really different in Nepal, Amy, which you don't see so much in India, is there's this cross-section of tradition, of Hindu tradition and Buddhist tradition there. So even some of the temples that we went into in Parping when we were researching there as well, there's a lot of Buddhist influence there. But you'll go into a temple and there you'll find, a Hindu statue and a Buddhist statue. So there's a nice cross-reference of the energy, not so much the religion, but these actual deities depict this kind of energy, and that's always what that temple would be referencing. That's what I saw on the research part of it there.
That's so interesting. And I suppose in some sense, and I definitely feel very underqualified in even really saying anything about this, but when you look, you've got tantric Buddhism as well. So you've got Buddhism, which seems obviously very separate to Hinduism, but when we're talking about what has informed the yoga that we know today, Tantra obviously has many, let's say, limbs or strands. But yeah, we look to tantric Buddhism, which has a lot of parallels or crossovers with well, of course, Tantra, but Hatha yoga, and even through the yoga that we know more commonly today. It's obviously been something that's really fed and informed our yoga practice. And it just really reinforces to me, because I've spent a lot of time in India over many years, but I haven't been to Nepal, and it's definitely been calling to me. But I think it's often an overlooked place. And yet what you've just shared really emphasizes that, particularly with respect to the yoga as we know it today, it's a very profoundly important and pivotal place to visit. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, even Goraknath and Matsendranath are depicted in Tibetan Buddhism. So Goraknath is called Goraksha. Matsendranath, they referred to him as a Buddhist teacher called Minimath. Yeah. And, they actually are depicted in the 84 Mahasiddhis. So in Tibetan Buddhism, they have the Mahasiddhis, and they're all depictions of these particular gurus. And the most interesting thing is they're all depicted in a Karana, which stems from the temple of Chidambaram in South India. And when we look into the Hatha Yoga, these depictions come in as the 84 asanas. So, it's definitely a big cross-reference in both places, and definitely worth visiting Nepal. I think a lot of people see Nepal as a hiking, mountaineering area, which it is. It's beautiful, the nature there, and it's there is so much there to visit, but there's so many great teachers that also exist there still, and from the history existed there. There was another teacher I came across when we were researching in Agni Yogana is Shiva Puri Baba, and he was also a Hatha Yogin, but he was from Kerala. His grandfather was an Jyotish in South India, and when his grandfather kind of passed all the teachings on to him, and when he decided he wanted to leave this material existence, he had his grandson take him into the forest, passed on the teachings, and said to him, "You have to stay here until you turn a certain age where you reach a certain level, and you'll know at that age when it's time to leave. But you won't be able to leave this world. Your dharma is to stay and walk the world." So Shiva Puri Baba at the age of 50 became enlightened and started walking. So, I mean, it's quite a story. And then he ends up in Nepal at the age of 90. I mean, he walked all over Europe. He understood all religion, Christian religion, Muslim religion, all the religions. So he could give advice and teachings, on his path when he was traveling to people who seeked his advice. When he ended up in Nepal in his 90s, he lived in the forest, and I actually took a trip when I was there up to this particular mata where he lived with the animals. And, of course, all the disciples wanted him to create an ashram and, learn the yogic teachings from him. And he was completely against any of that. And he said, "If you want, you can come and I will give advice and help." But he didn't want an ashram built at all. And in the end, when he got to the age of 137, he passed. But he was quite ill, I think, when he was like 125 or 26. I mean, incredible
Wow.
how old he was. And a couple of his disciples took him closer to the Pashupatinath temple, where they actually have a tomb there where you can go and visit as well. So some of the teachings that are in Nepal, Amy, a lot of it's not heard of. And even, Shiva Puri Baba was a Hatha Yogin, but he didn't even write a book. It was all as traditionally done, passed on through word of mouth. And some of his disciples have written stories or information about his life that you can find. But yeah, he was probably a more contemporary Hatha Yogin of that time. He was kind of early 19th century. He passed like 1920s or 30s.
Mm-hmm. Wow, it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating. It feels like just even hearing this from you and knowing this information just feels really treasured, because it could just be so easily lost and yeah.
Yes.
But you mentioned, just backtracking a little, you mentioned Chidambaram and the Karana, which really I'd love to delve into with you in my next question. But something's just come up for me just quickly. I'd love to ask you something, particularly as it pertains to shadow yoga specifically and how yourself and Shandor teach. And this relates to what you've been sharing. I noticed that through my own shadow yoga studies, which are very light and brief in the last couple of years, that many of the, let's say, terms or names that you use seem to be tied to Nepal. So just by example, instead of the three main nadis being Ida, Pingala, and Kundalini, or Shushumna, sorry, I should say, you use Lalana, Rasana, and Avaduti. Is that tied to the traditions from there, that region?
No, it's in the Hatha Yogic teachings as well. Both. You'll find that it's more common, the Idu Pingala Sushumna, in more of the, I guess, the later texts, but in some of the older texts, they still talk about the actual nadis, Lasana, Lalana, Rasana, and Avaduti, which is the
Right.
sexual pathway in those terms. But yes, there's that cross-reference. And I guess, shadow yoga is not a style. Although, nowadays we know most of the yoga, there's this style, that style. But the name that was given to the shadow yoga, it's Chaya yoga, which comes from the Chaya Purusha, which is in the Shiva Swarodaya in the 6th chapter, where it's spoken that it's through the different layers of the body or the shadows that we move from the gross to the subtle to connect with the individual soul. So when Shandor brought the name forward, of course, Chaya being a Sanskrit term, we thought for people to conceptualize it and understand it better in the Western world, we use the English term shadow, but it's just another synonym for the term Hatha Yoga. So the teaching of the preludes in the shadow yoga system, they are really there from the Vyayama, which is what we can call exercise, I guess, in the Western term, because the Vyayama is really just to prepare the body and remove obstructions to take you into the asana work, Hatha Yoga.
I do love that discernment. And that's one thing I've loved about my exposure to studying under a shadow yoga teacher, is that real, that differentiation. Like, here's the exercise, here's the Vyayama, and here is the asana in the true sense of the word.
Yeah.
Okay, so that might tie into us pivoting here. So let's talk about the concept and the teachings of Nritta, which has become a big part of your work. Personally, as I've mentioned to you before we started recording, Nritta was brought to my awareness about a decade ago through my studies in Odissi dance, and therefore, of course, through the significant texts, the Abhinaya Darpanam and the Natya Shastra. But what is Nritta? And in your experience, how has Nritta become or come to life through your work, and how is it tied to the yoga practice and, let's say, to Nataraja, so one of the forms of Shiva?
Yeah. It's a big question.
It's a few questions in there.
There's a few questions in there. Okay, the first thing, like practically, the best way I can explain is it changes rhythm. So if you look at anything in life, there is rhythm in nature, in how we behave. So by performing karana or doing the karanas, you're changing the rhythm with the body parts, which changes the mindset, which brings about a renewal for another mindset. Yeah. So rhythm, it becomes so relevant in everything in our life, whether it's our daily activity, our spiritual practice, whether it's exercise, because I always like to say to students too, your yoga sadhana is not exercise. You go exercise, go for a walk, go for a run, do a swim. Yogic sadhana is a spiritual practice. It's not exercising the body, which, as we know, it has become in the Western world and also the East now too. So when a good way for me to explain it also, Amy, is the term nritta is pure, its translation is pure dance. Okay. Natcha has to do with obviously the Odissi dance, Bharatanatyam, Kathakali. It's all performance orientated. So when we go to Chidambaram temple, where it's depicted Shiva as this form of Nataraj, the interesting thing in that temple too is in the inner section of the temple, they open it, once a year, and you see the star Orion, which is the same formation as the Nataraj. So it's very potent that they knew where they put these temples at different times, It was especially because the energy was there like that. Because we have the 5 Shiva temples in India which relate to the 5 elements, but this particular one has to do with space. So I could get quite esoteric here, but I won't talk, but just simple terms, if we look at the elements of space, there's the first, it was from space that everything came forth, from the void, from space. If you look at the child as it's growing, the shape of the fetus when it's very small, it looks like the ear, the shape of the feet. And the ear represents sound, space. So it's from that came forth all the other elements, the fire, the water, the earth, air, yeah? So Shiva, if we look at Shiva's aspect here, it's about that space and that rhythm that changes with that space, that brings forth a different mindset, relieves the body from different obstructions or impurities. But his dance of the 108 Karanas also, it's depicted in many different stories. Like you've read Abhinaya Dharpana's text, so there's all the different stories there, and they're all allegorical, because Shiva as a form of a deity is different to the aspect I'm talking about energetically. So it's through this form that he actually doesn't, I wouldn't, a lot of people talk about Shiva as the destroyer. Not the destroyer, he's the transformer. So this form is the transformer, but without Shiva, it's Shakti, nothing happens, because Shiva is static. Shakti, she is the one. So it's always those two energies that are working in any case. So the 108 Karanas depicted in Chidambaram have to do with theatrical performance, dance, and it's all through these movements that expression happens in performance. Then the 64 Karanas that they speak of, which relates to also to the 64 martial activities, has to do with martial arts, and also relates to the 64 blood mamas in the body. So, when we look at mama, which is a whole nother school of thought, but the mama system, it's through, let's say, through the mama, you can heal the person or you can kill the person. Yeah. So that's why it's used in martial activity. And then it's clearly spoken of that 32 to 36 Karanas are used for internal cultivation. So this was what, I guess, what Chandra and I developed, was these Karanas. It was very interesting because actually Chandra went to Chidambaram when I was studying Ayurveda in Kerala. And, we traveled for many years teaching. Thank God for the pandemic, because it made us kind of grounded a bit. So definitely going to Kerala for treatment as well was very good to have, with all the travel. But one year he said he just had this desire to go to Chidambaram. So he went by himself, and he actually met a sadhu there who he never saw again. But this sadhu took him to different parts of the temple, and it was the elephant grass where he showed him, which is not kind of seen, by the naked eye. Behind this elephant grass were these different Karanas that are used for internal cultivation. And, his story is when he was shown this, he understood how corrupted the asana had become in modern yoga, because, this sadhu just kind of lifted his leg and put it behind his head without the hands, not like pulling the leg in for Ekapada Raja Kapotasana or, Pashini Mudra, just no hands. Yeah. So it shows also that the power of those particular movements of Karana, and also that they take us towards the asana, because first you learn standing. So you need first to have your earth still for the other elements to fall into place. So hence, especially when you stand on one leg, and a lot of the Karanas, you're shifting your weight on the feet, which you would understand from the dance movements as well. So it was from these 32 to 36 we developed the different forms that we now teach. But it was an interesting process because, of course, you know, you look in the Natya Shastra and they have the Angaharas there, which are the arrangements of the Karanas. So we tried all of this, you know, but most of it was very flowery and it was all to do with dance. So that's how the understanding came through, and also from the teachings that Shandu was blessed with from the Sadhu in 2001, what Karanas were there for inner cultivation for the yogic activity. And from my practical perspective of teaching this pure dance or nritta, it really takes you into a trance. And it's the movement, you know, is also, they're small movements, they're not big movements. People have to pay attention to the extremities, the hands, the feet, coordinating those parts. And they're not, because of that finer process of the movement, it draws the mind in more, which brings forth that sense of one touching oneself. Yeah. And they even speak of Chidambaram being the seat of the seat of the heart is where Chidambaram is. So it's already saying that Shiva lives here in the heart. So this is where you dance, from this place. And the heart and the mind being so connected, it takes us to connect with the individual soul.
It's incredible. And I think perhaps, you know, when people see shadow yoga, and particularly something like nritta, it's very hard to even comprehend that depth that's behind the movement. I know I've pointed a lot of people and students of mine in the direction of shadow yoga teachers, you know, oh, you're in Melbourne and, you know, so forth, go seek out some shadow yoga. And they look it up and they think, oh, it looks like Tai Chi. You know,
Yes.
that's the first sort of comment that, you know, a lot of people make. And I think, well, first of all, you're not seeing perhaps the preludes, because that's obviously a different
Yes.
sort of set of forms. But I'm curious to know, so just to clarify, based on a few things you've said, and this is sort of more for my brain and anyone listening that is new or newish to shadow yoga, the nritta is, and this is going to be quite simplified, but nritta is generally based upon the karana, and the preludes are also, or that's more an emphasis on vyayama. Obviously there's more, let's say, postures in there that are from, let's say, more modern day yoga, but obviously the form, they look different, and obviously they have different intentions. So
Yes.
in a simplistic sense, what's the foundation of
Yes.
each, just to clarify?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Amy, because people get confused with that, because all of these teachings come under the shadow yoga school, which is to work with the Chaya Purusha, work through our different shadows or layers. So the shadow yoga is vyayama, and the standing activity from the shadow yoga preludes is drawn from martial activity, from dance, so this is why a lot of people say, oh, it's very martial, but if you look at most of the Hatha Yoga teachings, traditionally, Hatha Yoga, there was no standing work. It was all seats. Asana means seat. And, you know, inversions were important, but really because modern times we live so differently. So in these ancient times when the yogis lived, they used to walk for miles just to get water. Or, you know, they would go to the river. So they had already that movement with the legs and that activity. So their asana work was all they had to do. But nowadays, most people, as we know in the modern society, they sit for long periods of time. So this is where obviously the standing activity came into the yogic activity. And with the teachers like, you know, Patabi Joyce, Iyengar, who also learnt with Krishnamacharya. It was Krishnamacharya that actually taught at the Mysore Palace. And they were Kshatriyas, warrior caste. He was teaching all of this kind of martial stance work to those particular students. So this is the involvement of that, I think, that we can see from then to modern day now. But even back then, it was seen as modern, you know, and that's Theos Bernard, who was a Hatha Yogin from the States. I'm sure you've read some of his books. His father, who he learnt from, even said, you know, during that time he was around in the 30s, said that what was being taught was not, you know, what we call traditional Hatha Yoga, but it was more modern. because of this standing activity coming in. But it's very important that the standing work is there purely because it's that gives that base for the correct movement of prana. And it's the prana, if it's disturbed or if it's not circulating well, when I refer to prana, I mean the life force, then there's obstruction in the body. So first one has to learn to stand on one's feet, ground the mind in, it's from the feet that the source of power comes. And you see that in all of the dance, martial arts, and, it's even stated that the 108 karanas of Shiva's dance, they moved, and there's always that cross reference between India and China and Vietnam. I mean, there's even from my research with the Pashupatis, there's a Pashupata temple in Vietnam, in Hoi An, which is a UNESCO city just outside there. So, there was all these, they traveled all over Asia. It wasn't just India. Yeah. So this is why all of these movements from the Karanas that come into those activities, but they were taken in different methods depending on what the teaching was, whether it was Tai Chi, whether it was Qigong, whether it was martial activity, karate, and even when you look at, there's one particular, the Thai boxing, yeah, they actually use one of the karanas a lot in their preparation or their warm-up, which is the kunchitam, but the arm work is a little bit different. Yeah? So there's so much reference to it in different areas. So I guess when we introduced the shadow yoga preludes, it was developed from what we didn't know at that time as being these 108 karanas, but it was drawn from there, definitely. But it was for us seen more through these other activities, because both Chandra and myself have worked in, like, with the Shaolin martial activity. Chandra also had a background in martial arts, in his kind of 20s, 30s. So this is where that comes in. But then the work now with the Nritta, how that's been introduced. So you asked what's the difference. Definitely the prelude form is more vyayama, just to move at the obstruction. They're wide movements, they're broad movements. So the mind also is taken in that broad sense. The energy is spread in a broader way. Whereas the forms, the 38 to 36 karanas that we teach with the Nritta forms are more, pretty much that you're in Vaishaka. So Vaishaka is also what Adinath is depicted in. Adinath, they say, is the first guru. It's from Adinath that sprang forth Matsyendranath, Goraknath. So Adinath, Adi is Shiva, the one, yeah? And Vaishaka is when the feet are slightly turned out and your feet are just a little bit wider than the hips. And it's really, most of the karanas, you're moving in and out of that particular stance. So you're never very wide. So the movements are more contained, they're finer movements, more subtle movements. So they take you into that particular trance state because of that. And from my understanding of working with it for many years now and teaching it, it's what I see happens with the students. And it's interesting because when it's a group of students, it's almost like the whole room becomes one trance, and this is what the Pashupatis did. It's, in the Pashupata Sutras, that's what they say. They did the Karana. It was a trance activity to take them to the meditation.
And it's having studied the Nritta sadhana here in the last couple of years, you can tell that it is a more advanced practice, even though someone outwardly looking at it would think, oh, that's just kind of slow movement. But the steadiness required to master those movements and to be able to have the mind in such a state, requires a lot of strength and physical capacity that the preludes would offer. And even over the years, again going back to my dance studies, I've done a little bit of Kalaripayattu martial arts studies as well, and it's just been astounding in some sense, but also very affirming to see so many parallels between all these forms. And that's what I've found so nourishing about shadow yoga. It just feels so anchored in something that just highlights what is intrinsically intertwined in India, if that makes, and I should say Nepal as well, but let's say Indian subcontinent, but it's really evidence of that. And so with everything you've just shared, again, this perfectly segues into my next question for you. As yourself and Shandor have developed the shadow yoga, let's say, methods or approach, if you will, over many years, what do you feel are the key components of a complete practice or sadhana in a very practical sense, particularly speaking to anyone listening to this that is not familiar with shadow yoga as well? But what do you think are those key components to really have a wholesome practice or sadhana?
Commitment. One has to be committed, definitely. If you're not committed on the path from the beginning, I think you can't progress anywhere. It's like anything you want to learn, you have to have that commitment. And, there's 4 tools that you have, Amy, of cultivation. So if you look, like if we go back to the nritta, like nritta or pure dance, also they refer to it as without emotion. So, I was talking about how the other karanas are used so there's more emotion used when it's performing.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's internal cultivation, it's to have no emotion. So that doesn't mean no feeling, but no emotion. So the idea is that you taking it into a different state, the activity.
Mm.
The Hatha Tattva Kaumudi, which was translated in Lonavala by Dr. Gorot, he talks about in there's one particular shloka about the charanas. So the charanas we taught from the very beginning, it's in the Shadow Yoga Preludes, it's with the nritta. It's something that one does first off. And in the Hatha Tattva Kaumudi, it's also referred to as the Dasa Charanas, or the 10 roamings with the joints. And it's actually the focus, what they say in the shloka is that one should focus on the dancing Shiva when they do the charanas. So it already tells you that the charanas take you into that state of no emotion, abhava, yeah? And they're the first part of the 4 tools. So if we look at the charana, it's to loosen the body parts. That's all you're doing in the beginning. You need to loosen things up. But first, when one starts the activity, it's to start our activity, like I expressed before, it's not your yogic sadhana is a spiritual practice, a cultivation for the self. It shouldn't be selfish. It should be a selfless act. So the greatest act one can do with one's sadhana is to offer oneself into their vaya, which is the region of the lower abdomen where the Kundalini Shakti pervades. So we loosen with the charanas, the 10 roamings. Yeah. And then, so that's the first step or tool of cultivation, is to loosen the energy. And then you need to gather the energy, you need to assemble the energy, and then you need to absorb. So loosen with the charanas, you gather with the karana and asana, because they have to do with, again, the gross body parts, but they pull the mind into the more subtle area of the body. It starts to create that separation between the gross and the subtle, because when you use the body parts in this way, the prana starts to move, and where the prana goes, the mind goes. It gets happy, yeah, because it gets energy from that. And again, you're changing the rhythm. So you change the rhythm, you start to change the mindset. You start to have realizations of different patterns. And then, so we loosen, we gather, then we have to assemble. So the assemblage of the sadhana is with the mudra, the aspect of mudra. And that really comes in when one does, even Sarvangasana and its different variations are part of asana. But the different mudras that come in, especially Kapali mudra, which is nowadays referred to as Shirsasana, but when done in a particular manner on the right point on the head, it is a mudra. Yeah? And that sets you up for the seated activity of dhyana or meditation, which is where you absorb everything that you cultivated in the sadhana. So they're your tools.
What about, where does bandha fit into the mix there? Because I've noticed, bandha tends to be very lacking, let's say, in most modern postural yoga classes, but obviously it's something I immediately noticed was straight away part of attending a practice or a class with a shadow yoga teacher. So just in terms of the structure that you've just laid out, is that gathering, or where does the bandha fit into that?
Right at the beginning, when you start loosening. How? The tongue. They say the highest, there's all the different mudras they list. There's some texts list more than 10, but most generally they speak of 10. And the highest state of mudra is Kachari. So Kachari mudra is when the frenum is severed from the lower palate, and it's taken behind into this upper region where the sphenoid sinus is. So definitely not, they talk about cutting also the frenum in the text, but not everyone has to cut. This is where, so with the teaching also in the Shadow Yoga school, not so much in the beginning with the preludes, because that's really for the beginner as they start on the path, just to familiarize themselves with the gross parts of the body. And that's where the charanas are great, just learning those roamings. Is that the aspect of mantra comes in, and the placement of the tongue. So if you look at your tongue, when you place on the upper palate, you have the different points. So you have near the front teeth is the element wind. So generally speaking, when you do any activity, if you place the tip, and your tongue's a big muscle, it moves from the tip, it moves all the way to the head of the genitals in the male, female. So placing the tip near the front teeth, not touching the teeth, but just near, the tip of your tongue is like the fire. It's upward. And it also relates to the heart. So when you place the tip correctly, you relax the sides of the tongue, the root of the tongue, and you follow from the tip along the back of your tongue, that line, it will feed all the way to the perineum, and it will grip without you thinking with your mind, like, what most people do now, they end up with hemorrhoids, suck, like Mula Bandha, grip your anus. And it's a natural process that happens just purely with the tongue. That's why in Hatha Yoga, the tongue is given so much importance. It's the Saraswati. She runs along the tongue. She's the streamer, She's just like when we watch the Netflix or whatever you watch on television. Saraswati, she streams all the nadis. You have so many, thousands of nadis, but then they talk about the 12 main or 14 or 16, depending what text you look at. But the Saraswati, she streams all, and she's who? The goddess of sound. And sound, it brings light. So how you position the tongue, how you release the inner corners of the eyes, this region of the eyes, it has to do with the Shringataka Mama. It's also here and here, which when the eyes are pulled in correctly, it pulls all the senses, the ears, the tongue, the nose, and the nerves. So again, everything is drawn to the base. So Mula Bandha naturally grips. Uddiyana is the outcome of the correct exhalation process. So let's say when you're moving through activity, let's say with Karana, you're not staying long. When you get to asana, you spend more time in the asana work. So there you will find that the bandhas engage more so than when you're doing the standing. But just by using the tongue correctly, the throat releases, Jalandhara happens, the Uddiyana naturally grips with the release of the prana. I never like to say inhale, exhale. I like to use the term draw in and release more so, because that's what you're doing. It's expansion, contraction. And then the lower section grips. But the importance of Uddiyana is there from the beginning with Kriya. So this is why they give so much importance to Uddiyana, because without the Uddiyana, you can't start to access Nauli, which is all for the cleansing process. When you have Nauli, Kriya, Uddiyana, you remove all dosha. So all the elements then come into a good balance. I mean, I could go on with more, Amy, but
I'd happily listen to it. I'd happily listen. Can I just ask one little extra additional question there? So what about Kumbhaka? Because I've also noticed that in Shadow Yoga, there is this just subtle cultivation of the development of Kumbhaka, which again, attending classes, I've not seen it spoken to per se, but the instruction encourages that
Yes.
naturally to
Yes.
arise.
Yeah. So that's what I'm talking about. Most people, if they think, even if the mind thinks inhale, exhale, it thinks about your nose and you start pumping the breath with the lungs. But when you position the tongue correctly and the focus with the mind is correct there, and how the eyes release, you find the breath is then fed to the lower abdominal region where you're doing your greatest offering into the fire at the base. So you'll find that after the release, so when you're doing any movement, whether, especially when we look at asana, when you fold in, you find everything naturally contracts. So there's a pause. That's your kumbhaka. Yeah. When you do Uddiyana, let's say in the dynamic aspect of it as a cleansing, Uddiyana or Nauli Kriya, there's kumbhaka, there's no breath then. Yeah. So this is where one learns pranayama, and this is where Shakti Chalani Mudra becomes so relevant, which is later learned, seated. So when Shakti Chalani is done, it's more to do with what we call paridana. So it's that wrapping that happens. So it's, it looks like Nauli Kriya that you do standing, but that's just a cleansing. But when it's done seated, that internal wrapping of the cloak, as they refer to it, is what starts to cultivate more kumbhaka. In combination with Vastrika, your pranayama starts to come in. But just when you sit and, people do pranayama now, Nadi Shuddhi, Surya Beda, all these things, they're all therapeutic. They're not really pranayama because it's more, again, surface, because you're just, as Chandra always says, people playing with their nose. The real kumbhaka, it's an internal cultivation that happens through that understanding and focus with the tongue, with the movement. So even the movement becomes mudra. Yeah, this is later. Yeah, but in the beginning, you have to start somewhere. So in the beginning, charana, loosen it first.
It's interesting because everything you're saying only further emphasizes how it's almost impossible to even experience or move toward these things with the way that most modern postural yoga is practiced and performed and taught. There's this fast, hurried,
Yes.
physical and mental approach. Okay, I said that was my last question, but I've also got one more. I feel like we've just systematically moved through a practice here. So what about finally the rub downs? Are they sourced from Hatha texts? What's the?
Yes.
And I've noticed other teachers teaching them as well, and I love them. I think that's such a beautiful way to close a practice. But could you just touch on that briefly?
Yeah, definitely. It comes from, even Krishnamacharya talked about rubbing the body after pranayama as well, or after seating. If we look in other internal arts as well, they will rub the body. Some, I know in the Shaolin, it's more like they hit the body, to waken the prana. So it's more to do, the rub down is, it's really just to, if you've caused any disturbance with the prana, or it's almost like a wipe. When you get out the shower with all the water on you and you wipe the water off. So it's like you're wiping the body down, and you bring the mind back to the feeling of the gross body. So let's say, Amy, it's very important when we work more deeply with the absorption process, with the meditation, that one can go so deep inside oneself that it's hard to come back out into the world. Yeah. Especially like yourself being a mother, or, and having to deal with those daily things. Just that rubbing down, it pulls you back to the gross physical structure. So that feeling of, okay, this is, I'm here. I'm not in that dream state anymore, or I'm not on that other plane anymore. I'm back on this plane. So it's very important for that too.
A transition.
Yes,
Yeah.
transition from one sadhana back out to the daily grind.
Yes, because so many classes just end with shavasana, and you come up and you're almost drowsy in a sense. Whereas I think this approach can be helpful, and even to finish standing and doing the standing rub downs can be such a lovely, refreshing way to transition.
It's feeling again. It's just feeling, because when it has to do with the air element, the white, that touch. Air is to do with touch. So touching oneself, it's like, obviously you have some understanding with the Ayurveda too, like you've learnt that with Dr. Swoboda. And the, in the Ayurveda, it's all about the massage with the oil. So you're basically doing touch. You're actually touching, it's people actually touching oneself. Some people don't know how to touch themselves sometimes. And just learning the rub down and how the energy moves with the rub down, okay, now I can do my own massage with oil or without oil. It's very important.
I could probably ask you questions all day long. I appreciate so much of your time, Emma. We might wrap up here, but it's been incredibly enriching to listen to you and also for your contribution to just elevating the yoga community here in Australia and also around the world. It's tremendously invaluable. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
I think I've said enough.
It's been really fascinating. And for those listening, Emma has generously offered us an online 2-course bundle, which is available till the end of May, heavily discounted. It's going to be available for you at a cost of $50 only. A direct link to access this is on the Summit webpage, and this will be a wonderful resource for all students that would like to know and experience just a little bit more about Shadow Yoga. Otherwise, please head to shadowyoga.com to learn more about the work of Emma and Shandor, and perhaps seek out a Shadow Yoga teacher near you to go a little more in depth here. And if you head to shadowyoga.com/resources, you can find relevant recommended reading and definitely a wealth of absolutely illuminating blog articles, which I've loved, and much more. I want to say as well, if you have not seen the spectacular film by Emma, Agni Yogana, you can rent or buy it online right now on Vimeo. Emma, do you want to add something about your upcoming Pure Dance film as well?
Yeah, well, I'm in the process of researching that still. Yeah, so I guess, you can read about it on Pure Dance Film, I think it is .com, but it is definitely more about the teachings of Nritta, and it's, I guess, like I said, it's that whole quest that I'm going through now with research and, finding the last of the Pashupatis. That's kind of the tagline of the film. Is there any left? And it's that the film is really looking at that aspect of what I explained at the beginning about the Pashupata lineage.
It's very, very exciting. So do you have an anticipated approximate release date?
I'm not in a hurry, Amy, with it. And it's to get funding as well. Like yes. Documentary Australia, I have a page up there as well. So it's really still, I'm not in a rush with it. Agni Yogana happened very quickly. It was something that was there for like 10 years. And then it was through that process of wanting to make a film based on what, obviously you're doing with this summit as well, is really to introduce to people some of the deeper aspects of the teaching of yoga. Because the popular styles are great, and I think it's great that people are doing yoga, but most of it, as we know, is exercise more than yoga, but it's good at least people are doing something. But, for the deeper the practices, that's what I wanted to show with Agni Yogana, and it happened very quickly in the end, also because Shandor was initiated into the Nath Sampradaya in Nepal during the whole process of me starting the filming of Agni Yogana. And I think this is where people can see some of the connection between Nepal and India, because I do have interviews with the Nath lineage, and I also have interviews with Tibetan Buddhist teachers in there, which was what we touched on first. So let's see where the next film goes. It's all a work in progress and not in a hurry. I kind of have a feeling, I'll be 54 this year, so if I finish it by the time I'm 60, I'll be happy.
I'm sure it's going to be beautiful. I've loved seeing the trailer, and Agni Yogana was spectacular as well. And what we'll do is we'll pop the link to the Documentary Australia page for it, because then people can see the trailer, and if they'd like to contribute to the fundraiser, we can put that there. So I'll link that up as well for everybody tuning in. And thank you for tuning into the conversation. Don't forget, you can upgrade to gain lifetime access to all these wisdom-fueled conversations. And of course, again, Emma, it's really an absolute honor to have you as a guest on the summit, and immense thanks for your time and your unwavering dedication to the practice, to the path, to the teachings that we are all lucky enough to be deeply enriched by. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
If this episode was of value to you and your life, please subscribe. And if you can think of someone who would benefit from this dialogue, please do them a favor and send it their way. If you feel called, hop on over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review. This is the best way to get these conversations into the ears and hearts of our wider community, to those who need it most. You can find me at amyelandry.com or over on Instagram at amyelandry. May we all move a little closer to a life living in alignment.